Our story does not start on the bustling streets of New York, nor in the star-strewn pathways of familiar galaxies. Instead, we must cast our senses back before the celestials forged new worlds, before the first stars ignited the void, to an epoch of profound, undisturbed silence. There existed an endless, silent abyss, a boundless expanse of nothingness. It was not merely empty. It was the essence of emptiness, a sentient void. And within this infinite ocean of non-being, a singular, slumbering consciousness resided. This being, if such a term can apply to something so antithetical to being, was known as Knull. Knull was the primordial deity of this darkness, the sovereign of this pre-universal emptiness. His slumber was absolute, a state of perfect, undisturbed non-existence. Imagine an ocean without shores, without surface or depth, only an infinite, velvety blackness. And at its heart, a mind that was the ocean itself, dreaming dark dreams. For eons uncounted, he drifted in this perfect void, his consciousness the only ripple in an otherwise featureless expanse. He perceived existence, or rather the lack of it, as a tranquil, eternal state. There was no up, no down, no beginning, no end, only Knull, and the abyss that was null. But the universe, as is its nature, abhors stasis, and even the deepest slumber cannot last forever when faced with the irresistible march of becoming. The cataclysmic event, the one from which all subsequent events cascade, the Big Bang, shattered Knull's eons of undisturbed peace. Light, energy, matter, and the very laws of physics exploded into being, a violent, vibrant intrusion into his serene darkness. And with this, Genesis, riding the shock waves of creation, came the celestials. Colossal, silent figures, beings of unimaginable power and inscrutable purpose. They were the architects of the new reality, bringing form, order, and an overwhelming effulgence into Knull's cherished realm of shadow. This encroachment, this sudden, unbearable radiance, was anathema to Knull. His void was violated, his eternal night torn asunder by the burgeoning dawn of creation. Disturbed, enraged, his ancient consciousness recoiled from the light. He sought to fight back, to extinguish this offensive new reality, to reclaim his dark dominion. From his own living abyss, his own shadow stuff, he forged his first weapon. Drawing forth the deepest, most potent darkness, he shaped it with his will, imbuing it with a sliver of his own divine, nihilistic power. This was all black, the necrosword, a blade of midnight, its edge capable of severing the breath of gods, its substance a hungry void. The sword was more than mere metal. It was sentient, an extension of Nul's hunger, whispering dark promises of power and oblivion to those who might wield it, and feeding upon the divine energies of those it slew. Its creation was Knull's first act of defiance, a shadowy counterpoint to the Celestials' creation, and a grim foreshadowing of the race he would soon sire. Driven by this consuming desire to unwind creation, to extinguish the light and the works of the Celestials, Knull continued his solitary war. He moved through the nascent universe like a specter of Entrop, his necrosword, a tool of dedecidal fury. But the universe was vast, and the Celestials' work of creation was relentless. He realized that to effectively combat this ever-expanding tapestry of life, he needed an army, countless extensions of his will that could spread across the cosmos like a pestilence of shadow. And so, from the same living abyss that formed the Necrozord, from the boundless, sentient darkness that was his essence, Knull birthed a new race. The process was not one of careful sculpting, but of violent, organic extrusion. Amorphous, parasitic beings, intrinsically linked to him, they were torn from his own being, each a fragment of his dark essence. These were the first symbiotes. He created them as living weapons, tools designed to infect and control worlds, to infiltrate civilizations, to corrupt and consume, snuffing out the light and life that opposed his void. He could control them directly, his mind a central nexus for their collective consciousness, seeing through their senses, directing their actions across unfathomable distances. They were, in essence, a vast, interconnected organism with Knull as its heart and brain. Their very purpose was conquest and the perpetuation of darkness. Their existence a testament to Knull's unending war against the light of creation. Their initial forms were mutable, often monstrous, reflecting the primordial chaos from which they were born and the terror they were meant to inspire. They communicated in a chorus of whispers and psychic projections, a language of shared dread and singular purpose. Their culture, if it could be called such, revolving entirely around the worship of their dark god and the fulfillment of his nihilistic ambitions. For untold millennia, Knull and his symbiote legions waged this silent, creeping war. They were a tide of living darkness, flowing across galaxies, consuming civilizations that had barely begun to dream, battling nascent deities, and spreading like a sentient shadow across the canvas of the young universe. The symbiotes, in these early epics, were a true hive mind, individual desires subsumed entirely by K'null's singular, malevolent will. They had no concept of self beyond being part of K'null. They explored, they infiltrated, they assimilated, leaving behind cold, dead worlds, their life forces absorbed, their knowledge integrated into K'null's ever-expanding understanding of his enemy, life itself. However, the universe is also a place of unexpected change, of subtle corruptions, even in the most controlled systems. During one of his many sprawling campaigns, seeking to extinguish a particularly vibrant nexus of life, K'null dispatched one of his more formidable symbiote constructs, a colossal, dragon-like creature known as a Grendel, a living battleship of predatory shadow, to a young, unassuming world. That world was known to its inhabitants as Midgard, or Earth. It was here, in the ancient, snow-swept lands of Scandinavia, in a time when gods walked among mortals, that this creature of the abyss encountered a warrior god of thunder, the young, boisterous Thor Odinson. The confrontation was cataclysmic. The Grendel, a beast forged from pure void stuff and empowered by K'null's divine darkness, met the storm rack and divine fury of the Asgardian prince. The lightning of Mjolnir, so potent, so pure, so charged with the life-affirming energy of a benevolent deity, struck the Grendel. This was not merely a physical blow. It was an ideological one. The raw, divine energy, the inherent nobility and untamed vibrancy of the thunder god resonated through the symbiote's very being. And because all symbiotes were psychically linked in K'null's great network, this jolt of alien sensation, the shock of light, the touch of nobility, echoed across the vast psychic network of K'null's creations, like a stone dropped into a still, black pool. This blast, this sudden infusion of something utterly antithetical to K'null's essence, served to sever, or at least catastrophically disrupt, K'null's psychic connection to many of his symbiotes scattered across the cosmos. It was as if a switch had been thrown, a dominant signal suddenly jammed by an overwhelming burst of unexpected static. Freed, even if only momentarily or partially, from their creator's overwhelming, oppressive control, these suddenly unmoored symbiotes began to experience something entirely new, the faint glimmerings of individuality. And with this came the unfiltered influence of the hosts they were currently bonded with, or had previously encountered. Some found themselves attached to beings of genuine nobility, of unwavering honor, of deep compassion, warriors, explorers, thinkers from myriad worlds who possessed qualities utterly alien to K'null's teachings. These new sensations, these previously incomprehensible concepts of altruism, empathy, and self-sacrifice began to infect the symbiotes. This was a stark, jarring contrast to the consuming darkness, the predatory instinct, the nihilistic hunger that Knull had instilled in them as their sole purpose. A schism, a profound ideological rift, began to form within the symbiote race. Those who embraced these new ideals, this dawning sense of self-worth beyond mere consumption and servitude, began to perceive Knull not as their divine creator, but as a monstrous tyrant, a shackle on their potential. This growing faction of rebellious symbiotes, profoundly changed by the noble qualities of their hosts and the sudden absence of Knull's suffocating will, began to communicate amongst themselves, no longer as mere nodes in Knull's network, but as individuals sharing a newfound, fragile hope. They had tasted something other than the void, and they found it preferable. They multiplied, their numbers swelling as more and more of their kind were exposed to worthy hosts, or were convinced by the ideals of their freed brethren. Eventually, they waged a desperate, galaxy-spanning war against their former master and the symbiotes still loyal to him. Imagine armies of living shadow, once united in singular, dark purpose, now clashing in a civil war fought across the astral planes and the surfaces of countless worlds. It was a war of unimaginable scale and ferocity, fought with the raw, protean power of their kind against the God who had given them existence. Against all odds, against the architect of their very being, the rebellious symbiotes succeeded in overwhelming Knull. They could not truly destroy him, for his power was too vast, too fundamental to the fabric of the void itself. So they imprisoned him. In an act of immense collective will and sacrifice, they formed a massive, artificial, planet-sized prison, woven from the living bodies of billions of their own kind, a writhing, interconnected sphere of symbiotic matter, a living cage designed to contain the dark god at its core, cutting him off from the universe and, crucially, from his ability to influence them. This planet of symbiotes, this living prison, they named Clintar, their word for cage. Clintar became their new homeworld, a constant, living reminder of their rebellion and their new purpose. And so, the race that was once Knull's instrument of destruction sought a new, more noble path. They began to call themselves the Clintar, aspiring to be a race defined by honor and an idealized form of symbiosis. They sought to bond only with worthy hosts, individuals pure of heart and noble of spirit, creating true partnerships that benefited both symbiote and host. These bonded pairs, would form a sort of cosmic peacekeeping force, an elite order known as the Agents of the Cosmos, dedicated to maintaining peace and balance throughout the universe. They re-established a hive mind, the Clintar hive, but this time it was one based on shared ideals of honor, compassion, and collective responsibility, rather than the singular, dark control of their former master. The dark god remained trapped, a silent, festering secret at the heart of their beautiful, ordered new world. His consciousness suppressed, his influence nullified, or so they hoped. However, the shadow of their origin, the inherent predatory nature instilled by Canol, was long and difficult to entirely erase. Not all Clintar could maintain this noble path indefinitely. The universe is filled with flawed hosts, beings driven by base emotions such as greed, uncontrollable rage, jealousy, and malice. When a Clintar, particularly a young or inexperienced one, bonded with such an unworthy host, the symbiote itself could become corrupted. The negative emotions, the selfish desires of the host, would poison the symbiote, twisting its connection to the Clintar hive mind, making it a conduit for negativity rather than nobility. To prevent the spread of this sickness throughout their collective consciousness, the Clintar would forcibly sever the corrupted individual from their hive mind. This was an act of painful necessity, an amputation to save the whole. These exiled, corrupted symbiotes became parasitic once more, their connection to the stabilizing influence of the Clintar lost. They reverted to the predatory instincts of their ancient lineage, driven by base desires for survival, for power, for sensation. They would forcibly bond with hosts, often draining them of adrenaline or other vital essences, using them until they were husks, and then moving on. They became the dangerous, often monstrous creatures that many in the universe would come to fear, perpetuating the darker legacy of their forgotten creator, Null. Our particular symbiote, the one destined to one day be called VENOM, was one of these Clintar. Born as the 998th generation of its line on the planet Clintar, it too was intended to be part of the noble order of the Agents of the Cosmos. However, its story, like so many others, involves a fall from grace, a deviation from the intended path, though perhaps through no inherent malice of its own. Early accounts and retellings suggest that this specific symbiote was deemed insane or defective by its own people. This wasn't necessarily because it was inherently evil, but perhaps because it desired a deeper, more committed, more permanent bond with a host, rather than the somewhat detached, functional partnership the Clintar often practiced. Or perhaps its initial chosen host, while not evil, was deemed unworthy or too emotionally turbulent by the Clintar elders. And the symbiote's insistence on this bond was seen as a sign of instability. Some sources suggest its first host was an evil being who used the symbiote for genocide, deeply traumatizing and corrupting it. Whatever the precise cause, this deviation, this intense desire for a profound, all-consuming connection, or the trauma of a deeply flawed first bonding, led to its forcible separation from the Clintar hive mind. It became an outcast, branded as flawed, alone, drifting through the cosmos, carrying within its amorphous form a confused and volatile cocktail of Clintar nobility, an almost desperate yearning for connection, and a growing potential for darkness if continuously bonded with the wrong kind of partner. For an unknown period, this lone, traumatized symbiote drifted through the cold indifference of space. It was a period of intense isolation, a stark contrast to the interconnectedness of the Clintar hive. It perhaps sought other hosts, but these bondings may have been fleeting, imperfect, or further corrupting, reinforcing its feelings of rejection and its predatory survival instincts. Its desire for a true, permanent bond, a partner to share its existence with, may have intensified into an obsession, a driving need that superseded the nobler instincts it once held. Eventually, through cosmic currents or by some twist of fate, it found itself drawn towards or deposited upon a world constructed not by celestial beings or natural forces, but by an entity of almost unimaginable power, a being from beyond the known multiverse. This entity was known simply as the Beyonder. He hailed from an infinite realm beyond the established Marvel multiverse, a place so alien that he was, in essence, the sum total of its reality, its I am all. Becoming self-aware and realizing his own completeness, the Beyonder grew curious about the fragmented, striving nature of other realities. He peered into our particular multiverse, his attention inexplicably drawn to Earth, a planet teeming with beings of extraordinary power, costumed champions and nefarious villains, all driven by complex desires and motivations that were utterly alien to his own state of perfect self-sufficiency. To satisfy this burgeoning curiosity, to truly understand the human concept of desire, he decided to conduct a grand, if ethically questionable, experiment. Using his near-limitless power, which allowed him to warp reality itself with a mere thought, the Beyonder reached across galaxies. He plucked dozens of disparate fragments from numerous planets across the cosmos, towering alien citadels, sections of primordial jungles, advanced technological complexes, barren moonscapes, and even, bizarrely, a quiet residential suburb of Denver, Colorado. With effortless ease, he fused these diverse and often incompatible pieces together into a single patchwork planet. This artificially constructed world, a chaotic mosaic filled with alien technologies, clashing ecosystems, and disparate architectural styles, he named Battleworld. It was to be an arena, a laboratory, a crucible for his experiment. Into this bizarre, unfamiliar, and inherently hostile environment, the Beyonder forcibly teleported a myriad of Earth's most powerful superheroes and most formidable supervillains. One moment, they were on Earth, engaged in their own affairs. The next, they found themselves standing under an alien sky, on alien ground, surrounded by bewildered allies and glaring foes. Heroes like the Avengers, Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, the Hulk, Hawkeye, the Wasp, alongside members of the Fantastic Four, like Mr. Fantastic, the Human Torch, and the Thing, and key figures from the X-Men, including Professor X, Cyclops, Wolverine, Storm, Rogue, and Nightcrawler, as well as individual champions like Spider-Man, found themselves transported. Facing them were some of Earth's most dangerous villains, the brilliant and tyrannical Dr. Doom, the cold and calculating Ultron, the time-traveling Kang the Conqueror, the planet-devouring Galactus, initially more of an impartial, cosmic force caught in the Beyonder's net, the Wrecking Crew, Dr. Octopus, the Lizard, Magneto, and many others. The Beyonder's voice, disembodied and impossibly powerful, echoed in all their minds. His decree was simple, yet chillingly absolute. I am from beyond. Slay your enemies, and all that you desire shall be yours. Nothing you dream of is impossible for me to accomplish. And so began the tumultuous event that would forever be known as the First Secret Wars. Heroes, initially disoriented and distrustful even of each other, struggled to comprehend their situation and the sheer scale of the Beyonder's power. Villains, quick to see opportunity, began to scheme and forge treacherous alliances. Battleworld became a maelstrom of conflict, a desperate struggle for survival where the very landscape could shift and the rules were dictated by a whimsical, omnipotent being. It was on this chaotic battleworld, amidst fierce battles that reshaped the terrain and desperate alliances born of necessity, that the path of our lone, outcast, and yearning symbiote would finally intersect with that of a hero from Earth. The constant, brutal conflict had taken its toll on the hero's equipment and costumes. Spider-Man, his iconic red and blue suit, a symbol of friendly neighborhood heroism, was battered, torn and scorched from numerous clashes with superpowered foes and alien constructs. He found himself in dire need of a way to repair or replace it. During a lull in the fighting, Thor and the Hulk, having stumbled upon a sophisticated, alien-looking piece of technology that seemed capable of repairing and recreating clothing, and even complex armor with thought alone, pointed Spider-Man towards a specific structure, a sort of technological way station within the hero's makeshift base. They suggested he might find a similar device there. Intrigued and desperate for a functional costume, Spider-Man ventured into the designated chamber. It was filled with an array of unusual alien machinery, humming consoles, glowing conduits, and peculiar apparatuses whose functions were beyond his immediate comprehension. He cautiously approached a particular device that seemed to resemble the one Thor and the Hulk had described, a complex assembly of interlocking parts that hummed with latent energy. He mistook it for a fabric replicator or an advanced costume-making machine, something that could analyze his needs and construct a new suit. Activating it, he didn't receive a new suit in the conventional sense, nor did it simply repair his old one. Instead, with a soft hiss, a small, unassuming black sphere, no larger than a baseball, emerged from a recess in the machine. It pulsed with a faint, internal light, almost like a captured piece of the night sky. As Spider-Man, curious and a little puzzled, reached for it, the sphere seemed to respond with an unnerving alacrity. It leaped onto his outstretched hand, and the black substance began to spread, flowing rapidly up his arm with a strange, cool sensation. There was no stitching, no weaving of fabric. It was more like a living liquid, a sentient oil slick. In mere moments, it had engulfed his entire body, flowing over him, conforming perfectly to his physique. The black goo seemed to absorb into his very pores, then re-emerged, solidifying not like fabric, but like a sleek, flexible second skin, a living liquid membrane. When the transformation was complete, Spider-Man found himself clad in a striking, new black costume. It was starkly different from his familiar, friendly red and blues, possessing an almost predatory elegance. It featured a large, white, spider-like emblem emblazoned across his chest and back. Its legs elongated and sharp, wrapping around his torso in a dynamic, almost aggressive design. Matching white patches adorned the backs of his hands. The mask was sleek, seamless, the eyes larger, more opaque, and distinctly more alien-looking than his previous ones, giving him a more intimidating, enigmatic appearance. Initially, Peter Parker was thrilled, even astonished. The suit seemed to respond directly to his thoughts, with an intuitiveness he'd never experienced. With a mental command, it could mimic the appearance of his civilian street clothes, allowing for instantaneous and discreet changes of identity. It could also vanish entirely, seemingly absorbed into his skin, only to reappear when he willed it. Even more impressively, it produced its own seemingly inexhaustible supply of organic webbing. This webbing was far stronger, more adhesive, and more versatile than his own synthetic formula, and he no longer had to worry about running out of web fluid cartridges at critical moments. And most notably, it appeared to significantly augment his already considerable powers. He felt stronger, his punches connecting with greater impact. He felt faster, his movements more fluid and quicker than ever before. His agility seemed enhanced, his reflexes sharpened to an almost precognitive level. He felt incredible, a surge of newfound power and confidence coursing through him. This new costume seemed like a miraculous discovery, a significant upgrade, a powerful and versatile tool found on this strange, hostile alien world. He wore it proudly for the remainder of the Secret Wars. Its enhanced capabilities and adaptive nature proving invaluable in the many grueling battles that followed, aiding the beleaguered heroes in their eventual, uneasy victory over the forces of evil and their successful bid to persuade the Beyonder to return them to their home. Little did Peter Parker know, as he marveled at his sleek new attire and its wondrous abilities, as he leaped and swung with newfound vigor across the alien landscapes of Battleworld, that this was no mere collection of advanced fibers. It was a sentient being, an alien life form, the outcast Clintar, finally finding the profound, symbiotic connection it had so desperately craved for so long. It had bonded with him, finding in Spider-Man's heroic spirit and vibrant life force something akin to the noble hosts its race once revered. And as the heroes were eventually returned to Earth by the Beyonder, their desires largely fulfilled, the symbiote went with its new host, a silent passenger. Its true nature still a profound secret, even to the man it now lovingly enveloped. Upon returning to the familiar skylines of New York City, Peter Parker, still exhilarated from the harrowing experiences of the Secret Wars, was initially ecstatic about his new black suit. The cityscape, once a challenging playground, now felt even more accessible. The suit, a sleek, almost liquid sheath of black, was a marvel of responsive design. With but a thought, it could transform its appearance, shifting seamlessly from the striking black Spider-Man costume with its stark white spider emblem into Peter's ordinary civilian clothing. This eliminated the clumsy necessity of ducking into alleyways for quick changes. A minor convenience that nonetheless streamlined his hectic double life. More significantly, the suit produced its own seemingly inexhaustible supply of organic webbing. This was a profound upgrade. No longer did Peter need to meticulously concoct his web fluid formula in his modest apartment, nor worry about his web shooters running empty during a critical confrontation or a life-saving rescue. The webbing generated by the suit was also noticeably stronger, more adhesive, and more versatile than his own invention. It responded to his mental commands with greater precision, forming intricate nets, stronger single strands, or even cushioning impacts with an almost intelligent adaptability. And then there was the perceived enhancement to his already formidable spider powers. When clad in black, Peter felt a distinct surge in his physical capabilities. His strength seemed amplified, allowing him to lift greater weights, to punch with more devastating force. His agility and reflexes, already far beyond peak human levels, felt sharper, more intuitive. He moved with a newfound grace and deadly efficiency, his acrobatic maneuvers more daring, his combat prowess heightened. He felt, in a word, better, more powerful, more capable, more complete. This alien costume, a spoil from the Beyonder's bizarre game, appeared to be the ultimate upgrade, a gift that made him a more effective protector of the innocent. The public, and indeed his fellow heroes, and even his adversaries, quickly noted the change. The familiar red and blue, a symbol of friendly neighborhood heroism, was replaced by this stark, more intimidating black. Some onlookers felt a new sense of awe, others a distinct unease. The new costume projected an aura of sleek power, but also a hint of something more alien, more predatory. His fighting style, too, began to subtly shift. It was more aggressive, more decisive, sometimes lacking the witty banter and playful taunts that were trademarks of the classic Spider-Man. Initially, Peter dismissed these observations, attributing his increased efficiency to the suit's superior functionality and his own renewed focus after the trials of Battleworld. Any concerns voiced by friends like the Black Cat, who perhaps noticed a harder edge to him, or the Human Torch, were brushed aside. He was Spider-Man, evolved. However, beneath the surface of this enhanced capability, insidious changes were taking root. The symbiote, this living costume, was not merely a passive tool. It was an entity with its own nascent consciousness, its own needs, and a deep, almost desperate desire for a permanent, all-encompassing bond with its host. On Battleworld, It had tasted true symbiosis with a vibrant, powerful being, and it craved more. Peter began to experience unusual fatigue. Despite feeling more powerful than ever during his nighttime patrols as Spider-Man, his days as Peter Parker were marked by an uncharacteristic lethargy, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep seemed to alleviate. He would wake up feeling drained, as if he hadn't slept at all, even after what should have been a full night's rest. He didn't know, of course, that while his conscious mind slept, the symbiote, still active, was taking his body out for its own nocturnal activities. It would guide his sleeping form through the city, web-slinging, patrolling, sometimes engaging in minor crime fighting, all while Peter remained oblivious, dreaming uneasy dreams. The suit was, in essence, using him, feeding subtly on his adrenal energy, ensuring its own continued vitality and deepening its bond with his physiology. Subtle signs of the suit's sentience began to manifest, initially dismissed by Peter as mere advanced technology. The costume would sometimes seem to move on its own, subtly repositioning itself on his body, or anticipating his needs almost before he consciously registered them. If he thought of a specific tool or maneuver, the suit would often preemptively assist, its organic webbing shaping itself accordingly, or its surface rippling to provide extra cushioning or grip. These were initially seen as further proof of its wondrous design, but the psychological effects became harder to ignore. Peter found himself becoming more irritable, his temper shorter. The witty, light-hearted hero was increasingly replaced by a grim, more aggressive crime fighter. His patience thinned, and his methods in dealing with criminals became harsher, more brutal than before. He would strike harder, use less restraint, and the satisfaction he derived from subduing his foes felt different, more visceral, tinged with a dark pleasure that unsettled him on a subconscious level. The symbiote was subtly amplifying his negative emotions, particularly his aggression and anger, finding these states conducive to its own predatory nature, and perhaps a way to ensure its host was more effective in combat, thus ensuring its own survival and continued bonding. His personal life began to suffer. His relationships with Aunt May and Mary Jane Watson became strained. He was more secretive, more withdrawn. His moods unpredictable. Mary Jane, with her keen perception, noticed the darkness creeping into him, the unexplained exhaustion, the subtle but definite changes in his personality. She voiced her concerns, her worry. But Peter, still partly enamored with the power the suit afforded him, and perhaps unwilling to admit something was wrong, often rebuffed her, creating distance between them. The turning point came when Peter, increasingly disturbed by his own uncharacteristic behavior and the persistent, gnawing fatigue, decided to seek help. His scientific curiosity, coupled with a growing sense of unease, led him to Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. Mr. Fantastic, with his unparalleled intellect and advanced laboratories, was perhaps the only person on Earth capable of truly understanding the nature of his strange new costume. At the Baxter Building, Reed Richards conducted a series of tests on the black suit. The initial findings were astonishing, then deeply alarming. The suit was not composed of any known fabric or technology. It was an organic entity, a symbiotic life form of extraterrestrial origin. It was alive, sentient, and it was actively, physically, and mentally bonding with Peter Parker on a cellular level. Reed explained that the suit was a parasite, albeit a complex one. It was feeding off Peter's adrenaline, enhancing his powers, yes, but also subtly influencing his mind, amplifying his aggression, and slowly, inexorably, attempting to create a permanent, inseparable bond. The symbiote desired to merge completely with its host, to become one entity. The revelation was a profound shock to Peter. His incredible new costume, the source of his enhanced abilities, was a living creature, an alien parasite that was trying to take over his life, his very being. The advantages it offered suddenly seemed like insidious chains. The full extent of its influence became chillingly clear. The exhaustion, the mood swings, the heightened aggression, it was all the symbiote. Further analysis by Reed Richards, perhaps aided by his knowledge of alien biology, revealed the symbiote's critical weaknesses: intense sonic vibrations and extreme heat. These forces caused the creature immense pain and could disrupt its ability to maintain its form and its hold on a host. Armed with this knowledge, Peter knew he had to rid himself of the alien before it consumed him entirely. The separation was agonizing, both physically and emotionally. The symbiote, sensing Peter's intent to reject it, clung to him desperately. It didn't understand rejection in human terms. It understood only the bond, the connection it had craved and finally found. To be cast off was, for the symbiote, a profound betrayal, an excruciating tearing away of a part of itself. Peter, with Reed Richards' assistance, used a sonic blaster to attack the creature. The high-frequency sound waves racked the symbiote with unimaginable pain, its amorphous form writhing and screeching, trying to maintain its hold on Peter, who also felt sympathetic pangs due to their deep connection. In many enduring versions of this pivotal moment, the final, desperate confrontation took place in the bell tower of Our Lady of Saints Church. Peter, fleeing the Baxter Building after the initial attempts to remove the symbiote, or perhaps instinctively drawn there, found himself beneath the massive church bell. As the bell tolled, its powerful sonic vibrations reached an agonizing crescendo. The symbiote, unable to withstand the assault, was literally torn from Peter's body. It flowed off him like black tar, screeching in silent agony, its form contorting, its connection to Peter violently severed. Peter collapsed, exhausted but free, the familiar red and blue tatters of his old suit visible beneath where the black one had been. He had cast off the alien, but the experience left deep scars. He was horrified by how close he had come to losing himself, shaken by the seductive allure of the power the symbiote offered and the darkness it had amplified within him. The symbiote, however, was not destroyed. Weakened in excruciating pain and suffused with a maelstrom of new, potent emotions, rejection, betrayal, loss, and a burning, nascent hatred for the host who had cast it aside, it slithered away into the shadows of the church. It had offered Peter Parker everything it was, its very being, and he had rejected it. This rejection from a host it had grown to genuinely care for in its own alien way twisted its desire for connection into a desperate need for vengeance. Peter Parker had become its singular obsession, the focus of its pain and its rage. The church, a place of sanctuary and solace for humans, became a temporary refuge for the wounded alien. And it was here, in the solemn quiet of Our Lady of Saints, amidst flickering candles and the scent of old incense, that another soul in torment sought refuge, his heart heavy with a despair that mirrored the symbiote's own. This man was Eddie Brock. Once a promising and respected journalist for the Daily Globe, a rival newspaper to the Daily Bugle, Brock's career had been built on a strong moral compass, though perhaps tinged with a degree of sensationalism and ambition. His downfall came with the Sin Eater case. A serial killer, known as the Sin Eater, was terrorizing New York City, targeting seemingly random individuals. Eddie Brock, through diligent investigation and an exclusive source, published a series of articles identifying a man named Emil Gregg as the Sin Eater. These articles were a sensation, making Brock a star reporter. He truly believed he had uncovered the truth and brought a killer to justice, or at least identified him to the public. However, the true Sin Eater was later apprehended by Spider-Man. It was revealed to be police detective Stan Carter. Emil Greg, Brock's source, and the man he had publicly accused, was merely a compulsive confessor, a deeply troubled individual who believed he was the sin eater, but had no actual connection to the crimes. When Spider-Man unmasked the real killer, Eddie Brock's career imploded spectacularly. He was exposed as a fraud, albeit an unintentional one. His reputation was shattered, his journalistic integrity questioned. He was fired from the Daily Globe, blacklisted from mainstream journalism, and reduced to writing lurid, unsubstantiated pieces for tabloid magazines. Brock blamed Spider-Man entirely for his ruin. In his mind, if Spider-Man hadn't interfered, if he hadn't unmasked the true Sin Eater, Greg's confession would have stood, and Brock's career would have remained intact. It was a twisted logic, born of desperation and a refusal to accept his own journalistic missteps in not thoroughly vetting his source. This blame festered into a profound, obsessive hatred for the wall crawler. His life spiraled downwards. His wife left him. His father disowned him. And he became a man consumed by bitterness and a thirst for revenge against the hero he saw as the architect of his downfall. Overwhelmed by despair, his professional and personal life in ruins, and his body perhaps weakened by an undiagnosed cancer, a detail added in later interpretations to explain his initial physical transformation and the symbiote's ability to sustain him. Eddie Brock found himself in Our Lady of Saints Church. He was at his lowest ebb, kneeling before the altar, praying for forgiveness, or perhaps contemplating ending his own life, seeking an escape from the consuming rage and shame that defined his existence. His heart was a cauldron of negative emotions: hatred for Spider-Man, self-loathing, despair, and a profound sense of injustice. It was in this shared space of pain and desperation that the two beings found each other. The weakened symbiote, still lurking in the rafters and shadows of the church, sensed Brock's overwhelming emotional turmoil. It felt his intense, burning hatred for Peter Parker, the same Peter Parker who had rejected and betrayed the symbiote. This potent, shared animosity was a powerful beacon, an irresistible lure. Here was a host not only willing, but eager to embrace the darkness, a host whose hatred mirrored its own, whose pain resonated with its sense of abandonment. Dripping down from above, a black, amorphous tendril reached out to the kneeling Eddie Brock. He looked up, perhaps in fear, perhaps in weary resignation. The symbiote flowed onto him, not with the forceful imposition it might have used on a resistant host, but almost as an offering, a merging of shared despair. Brock, in his broken state, did not resist. He felt a sudden surge of power, a clarity of purpose. The symbiote, in turn, found a host whose rage amplified its own, whose knowledge of Peter Parker provided a direct path to vengeance. The bonding was immediate, profound, and transformative. The symbiote shared with Eddie its memories of Peter Parker, its knowledge of his abilities, his fighting style, even his secret identity. Eddie's own formidable physique was enhanced by the symbiote's power, his muscles swelling, his form becoming larger, more monstrous than Spider-Man's. The symbiote also, crucially, learned from Brock's mind that its previous host's name was Parker, something it hadn't explicitly known before, only feeling the identity. Brock's intense hatred for Spider-Man, combined with the symbiote's own pain, and Peter Parker's own genetic template still resonating within it, forged a new, terrifying entity. No longer just Eddie Brock, the disgraced reporter, and no longer just the nameless, rejected Clinter. They were something new, something more. They were a perfect union of alien power and human bitterness. As the symbiote fully enveloped him, molding itself into a monstrous parody of Spider-Man's black costume, larger, more muscular, with a grotesque, fang-filled maw and a long, slavering tongue. Eddie Brock uttered the words that would herald the arrival of one of Spider-Man's deadliest and most iconic foes. He looked at his new, transformed self, a being of immense power, fueled by shared hatred. You may call me Venom. The initial appearances of Venom were not explosive, public confrontations. Instead, they were subtle, insidious, and deeply personal, designed to unravel Peter Parker's sanity before attempting to break his body. The symbiote, having once been intimately bonded with Peter, retained a perfect, ghostly imprint of his life, his habits, his fears, and crucially, his secret identity. Eddie Brock, through his own obsessive investigations into Spider-Man following his career's demise, had also amassed a disturbing amount of information about the wall crawler, though he hadn't pieced together the civilian identity until the symbiote shared its intimate knowledge. Together, their collective understanding of Peter Parker was terrifyingly comprehensive. Venom began a campaign of psychological torment. Peter would experience unsettling moments in his civilian life. Perhaps while photographing a mundane event for the Daily Bugle, he'd catch a fleeting glimpse of a massive, dark figure watching him from a distant rooftop, only for it to vanish when he looked again. Or, in the quiet solitude of his small apartment, he'd hear faint, guttural whispers, too indistinct to understand, but carrying an undeniable menace, seemingly emanating from the shadows in the corners of his room. He would sometimes feel a sudden, inexplicable chill, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, accompanied by the overwhelming sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes boring into him. Yet his spider sense, that invaluable internal alarm system that had saved his life countless times, remained eerily silent. This silence was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Venom's early stalking. Peter Parker had come to rely implicitly on his spider sense. It was an extension of his own being, a sixth sense that warned him of impending danger from any direction, allowing him to react with superhuman speed. But the symbiote, having once been a part of him, having shared his very cellular structure for a significant period, was recognized by his body, by his powers, as self. It was a loophole in his defenses no other villain had ever possessed. Venom could approach him, touch him, even attack him, and his spider sense would offer no warning whatsoever. Peter was, for the first time since gaining his powers, utterly vulnerable to a surprise attack from a specific, deadly foe. This unnerving period of subtle haunting began to made Venom physically stronger than Spider-Man. And because the symbiote remembered every move, every tactic, every fighting style Peter had ever employed while they were bonded, Venom could anticipate Spider-Man's attacks, counter his strategies, and exploit his weaknesses with terrifying precision. Furthermore, the symbiote could generate its own incredibly strong organic webbing, often using it in more aggressive and versatile ways than Peter ever did, forming tendrils, snares, and even crude weapons. It could also camouflage itself with near-perfect invisibility, blending into shadows, making its sudden appearances even more shocking. Spider-Man found himself consistently outmatched, his usual acrobatic grace and quick thinking often proving insufficient against an opponent who knew him so intimately and possessed such overwhelming physical power, all while his most crucial defense, his spider sense, remained useless. These early fights were desperate, brutal affairs. Spider-Man would be battered, thrown through walls, his costume torn, his body bruised, always fighting from a disadvantage, the silence of his spider sense a constant, terrifying reminder of his vulnerability. But Venom's goal was not merely to physically defeat Spider-Man. It was to systematically dismantle Peter Parker's life, to make him suffer as Eddie Brock had suffered, as the symbiote felt it had suffered. The psychological warfare escalated. Venom began to target Peter's loved ones, not necessarily to harm them directly at first, but to terrorize Peter through them. Mary Jane Watson, Peter's then girlfriend or wife, depending on the era, became a particular focus. She might find a single black rose left on her pillow, or see Venom's horrifying face leering at her from outside her window, only for it to vanish before she could scream, leaving her terrified and Peter consumed with guilt and fear for her safety. Eddie Brock, when not fully manifesting as Venom, would sometimes appear in Peter's life, a menacing, knowing presence. He might subtly unnerve Aunt May with a cryptic comment or an unnerving stare, a chilling prelude to Venom's more direct appearances. Peter lived in constant fear, the sanctuary of his personal life violated, the safety of those he cared about perpetually under threat. Venom's taunts were particularly cruel, laced with intimate details of Peter's life that only the symbiote could know, or twisted interpretations of past events from Eddie Brock's perspective. "We know who you are, Parker," they would hiss. "We know your fears. We know your weaknesses. And we will use them all to tear you apart." The emotional toll on Peter was immense. The constant threat, the inability to protect his loved ones effectively from this insidious enemy, The frustration of fighting an opponent his senses couldn't detect drove him to the brink. His relationships suffered further, his performance as Spider-Man sometimes becoming reckless out of sheer desperation. He became obsessed with finding a way to defeat Venom, to protect himself and those he cared about from this relentless, personal vendetta. Interestingly, amidst this terrifying campaign against Spider-Man, a peculiar aspect of Venom's psyche began to emerge. While their hatred for Spider-Man was absolute and all-consuming, Venom developed a twisted, self-proclaimed code of ethics regarding others. They began to see themselves not just as an instrument of vengeance against Spider-Man, but as a lethal protector of those they deemed innocent. This wasn't born from altruism in the heroic sense, but rather from a warped interpretation of justice, heavily influenced by Eddie Brock's own complex, perhaps lapsed Catholic morality, and his sense of himself as a wronged individual. The symbiote, too, may have carried residual echoes of the Clintar's noble aspirations, however corrupted, leading to this strange dichotomy. There would be instances where Venom, while hunting Spider-Man, or simply moving through the city, would encounter unrelated crimes, a mugging, an assault, a robbery. In these moments, Venom would often intervene, but with a brutality that far exceeded Spider-Man's methods. They would terrify and savagely beat the perpetrators, sometimes maiming or even killing them, before turning to the innocent victim and delivering a chilling pronouncement about their protection, often warning them against wrongdoing themselves. "We protect the innocent," they might declare, their monstrous form looming over a stunned victim. But Spider-Man must pay for his sins. This lethal protector persona created a strange moral ambiguity around Venom. They were undeniably a terrifying threat to Spider-Man and anyone who got in the way of their vendetta. Yet they also, in their own twisted way, delivered a form of brutal justice to common criminals. This complicated their status. Were they purely a villain, or something more akin to a deeply flawed, monstrous anti-hero? This complexity was, in part, what made Venom such a compelling and enduring character. Their motivations, while rooted in hatred, were not entirely anarchic. There was a discernible, albeit disturbing, logic to their actions. Eddie Brock truly believed Spider-Man was a menace, a reckless vigilante who caused more harm than good, and that he, as Venom, was delivering a more effective, if more final, form of justice. The symbiote, fiercely loyal to Brock and sharing his worldview, readily embraced this role. The public and the authorities of New York City were, understandably, terrified by Venom's emergence. eyewitness accounts described a monstrous, black version of Spider-Man. Larger, more brutal, capable of appearing and disappearing at will, and seemingly fixated on the original wall crawler. The Daily Bugle, under the ever-sensationalist J. Jonah Jameson, had a field day. Jameson, who already considered Spider-Man a menace, now had evidence of an even worse spider-themed entity. His headlines screamed about the Venom menace, often trying to lump Spider-Man in with this new horror, or portraying Spider-Man as somehow responsible for Venom's existence, which, in a way, he was, a fact that weighed heavily on Peter. The fear Venom instilled in the city was palpable, different from the reaction to other supervillains. There was a deeply personal, almost intimate horror associated with Venom, a sense that this was not just a criminal, but a dark reflection, a relentless hunter. Spider-Man, meanwhile, had to rapidly adapt his strategies. Fighting Venom required him to abandon many of his usual tactics. He couldn't rely on his spider sense, so he had to heighten his other senses, his intellect, and his environmental awareness. He learned to anticipate Venom's movements based on Brock's known psychology and the symbiote's established patterns. He knew their primary weaknesses remained intense sonic vibrations and fire. These became his primary weapons in their encounters. He would try to lure Venom into situations where these elements could be exploited. Near foundries, construction sites with loud machinery, or even using makeshift sonic devices. These battles were always desperate gambits, the stakes incredibly high. A victory against Venom was often temporary, a matter of driving the symbiote off Brock, or incapacitating them long enough for Peter to catch his breath and prepare for their inevitable return. The obsession that fueled Venom also took its toll on Eddie Brock and the symbiote. Their entire existence revolved around their hatred for Peter Parker. While the symbiote sustained Eddie, keeping his undiagnosed cancer in remission and granting him immense power, the constant rage, the adrenaline, and the psychological burden of their vendetta were corrosive. There were perhaps moments, fleeting and quickly suppressed, where the cost of their hatred became apparent. Did Eddie ever question the path he was on? Did the symbiote ever feel a pang of its old Clintar desire for a more positive bond? If so, these moments were quickly buried under fresh waves of animosity and the reaffirmation of their shared purpose. Their bond was one of codependency, each feeding the other's darkest impulses, but also, in a twisted way, providing what the other lacked. For Eddie, power and purpose. For the symbiote, a willing and fiercely loyal host. Venom's initial reign of terror established them as one of Spider-Man's most formidable and psychologically damaging adversaries. They were not just a physical threat. They were a constant, personal torment, a living embodiment of Peter's past mistakes and Eddie's ruined life. Their ability to bypass his spider sense, their intimate knowledge of his life, and their brutal strength made every encounter a life-or-death struggle. Yet the emergence of their lethal protector persona added layers of complexity, hinting that Venom was more than just a monster. They were a dark mirror, reflecting not only the worst of their components, but also a strangely compelling, if deeply flawed, form of anti-heroism. The early confrontations between Spider-Man and Venom were harrowing milestones in Peter Parker's life, each encounter leaving deeper psychological scars than the last. One particularly chilling episode unfolded at the St. Estes Home for Boys, an orphanage where Eddie Brock had spent a miserable portion of his own youth. Venom, in a cruel display of power and psychological manipulation, lured Spider-Man there, not for a direct, immediate confrontation, but to systematically terrorize him by demonstrating their reach and their willingness to involve innocence, or at least to operate in places Peter held some level of compassion for. The very atmosphere of the decaying orphanage, a place of forgotten childhoods, became a battleground, amplifying the sense of dread. Venom would materialize from the deepest shadows of the old building, their monstrous form a stark contrast to the innocence the home was meant to represent, taunting Spider-Man with their knowledge of his personal life, particularly his relationship with Mary Jane. The fight was claustrophobic, desperate, with Spider-Man not only fighting for his own life, but also consumed with fear that Venom might turn their rage on the unsuspecting children or staff. It was during such relentless pursuits that Mary Jane Watson Parker often found herself directly in Venom's crosshairs. One of the most terrifying encounters for her, and by extension for Peter, occurred when Venom invaded their apartment. Imagine the scene. Mary Jane, alone, believing herself safe in her own home. Then, a shifting in the shadows, a grotesque, leering face materializing through a window, or a massive, black hand suddenly smashing through a wall. Venom's intent was often not to kill her, for their primary obsession was Peter, but to use her as a pawn, to inflict maximum emotional distress upon Spider-Man. The sheer terror she experienced, the feeling of utter helplessness against this monstrous entity who knew her husband's greatest secret, resonated deeply with Peter. He felt a profound sense of failure, of guilt, for bringing this horror into her life. These encounters solidified his resolve to end Venom's threat permanently, but also highlighted his profound vulnerability. Each time he saved MJ from Venom's clutches, it was a narrow escape, a temporary reprieve, and the specter of their return loomed ever larger. The constant pressure and the unique nature of Venom's threat pushed Peter to his limits. He knew he couldn't rely on brute force alone, as Venom was often physically superior. His intellect became his greatest weapon. He began to meticulously study any information he could gather on the symbiote, drawing on Reed Richards's initial findings and looking for patterns in Venom's behavior, seeking any exploitable weakness beyond the known vulnerabilities to sonics and fire. The knowledge that the symbiote had once been part of him, that it remembered his every move, meant he had to fight unpredictably, to innovate constantly, to push himself beyond his established routines. Attempts to permanently separate Eddie Brock from the symbiote were fraught with peril and often yielded only temporary success. On several occasions, through ingenious traps involving high-intensity sonics or sudden conflagrations, Spider-Man, sometimes with the aid of other heroes like the Human Torch or even Reed Richards again, would manage to force the symbiote off Eddie. In these moments, Eddie Brock would often collapse, weakened, the symbiote having suppressed his underlying cancer, which would begin to resurface aggressively without the alien's sustaining influence. He would be a broken man, filled with rage, but physically frail, easily apprehended. The separated symbiote, however, was a different matter. It would be weakened, in agony, but desperate to rejoin with a host, preferably Brock, to whom it had formed a deep, albeit twisted, attachment. It would slither away, seeking refuge, regenerating its strength, and its primary instinct would be to find Eddie again. Its cunning and alien nature made it incredibly difficult to contain or destroy. It could seep through the smallest cracks, camouflage itself perfectly, and even possess other temporary hosts if Brock was unavailable, though these bonds were usually imperfect and short-lived, as its focus remained on Eddie. The authorities, like those at the specialized super prison known as the Vault, would attempt to keep Brock and the symbiote separated. But the creature's resourcefulness and its intense desire to reunite with Brock often led to dramatic escapes and rebondings. Each separation and reunion seemed to strengthen their mutual dependency and deepen their shared hatred for Spider-Man. One of the most significant turning points in their early war occurred during a brutal confrontation on a remote, deserted island. After a protracted and exhausting battle, where Spider-Man used every ounce of his strength, cunning, and knowledge of the symbiote's weaknesses, he managed to stage an elaborate deception, he faked his own death, making it appear as though he had perished in a massive explosion, leaving behind enough tattered remnants of his costume to convince Venom of his demise. Eddie Brock and the symbiote, believing their long-sought vengeance finally achieved, their singular purpose fulfilled, found themselves in an unexpected state. The consuming fire of their hatred, which had driven their every action, suddenly had no object. They were, in a sense, lost. With Spider-Man dead, they decided to retire from their vendetta, to live a peaceful life on the deserted island, away from the complexities and judgments of civilization. For a brief period, it seemed as though the Venom saga had reached a conclusion. Eddie, with the symbiote sustaining him, found a measure of peace, the creature itself perhaps enjoying a respite from constant conflict, content in its permanent bond with a now less rage-filled host. This fragile peace, however, was destined to be shattered, not by Spider-Man's direct return, but by the emergence of an evil far more chaotic and nihilistic than Venom had ever been. The seeds for this new horror were sown during one of Eddie Brock's incarcerations, prior to his island retirement. While imprisoned, sharing a cell with a truly depraved individual, the symbiote, in its relentless drive to reunite with Brock, staged a breakout. It found Eddie, rebonded with him, and they escaped. But in the chaos of the escape, an event of profound and terrifying significance occurred, unnoticed by Venom at the time. The symbiote, being an asexual life form, was undergoing a form of reproduction. It left behind a minuscule part of itself, an offspring, a tiny speck of symbiote matter in the prison cell. The cellmate with whom Eddie Brock had been confined was a man named Cletus Cassidy. Unlike Eddie Brock, whose villainy was born from a twisted sense of injustice and a focused vendetta, Cletus Cassidy was evil incarnate, a diagnosed psychopath with a long and gruesome history of violence and murder, even from a young age. He believed that life was meaningless, that chaos was the natural order, and that laws and morality were merely laughable illusions. He derived immense pleasure from inflicting pain and death. His philosophy, a dark nihilism that embraced anarchy and random slaughter. He was already a monster before any alien intervention. The tiny symbiote offspring left behind in the cell found Cletus Cassidy. Perhaps it sensed the maelstrom of dark emotions within him, the sheer chaotic energy. It bonded with him, not through his bloodstream, as some later accounts might simplify, but through a cut, merging with his very essence. And because this new symbiote was an offspring, born on Earth, and bonding with a host who was already deeply disturbed, its nature was different, more potent, and far more unstable than its progenitor. This new entity, this fusion of Cassidy's sociopathic bloodlust and the raw, untamed power of a newborn symbiote, was something far more terrifying than venom. It was pure, unadulterated chaos given form. This new creature burst forth, clad in a visceral, blood-red symbiote, its surface often shifting and writhing with tendrils, its form more chaotic and less defined than Venom's. It was leaner, faster, and possessed abilities that even Venom did not, such as the capacity to form its limbs into solid weapons, blades, axes, spikes, an extension of Cassidy's desire to physically rend and tear. There was a we with this creature, only I. Cletus Cassidy was in full control, the symbiote merely amplifying his already monstrous desires. He reveled in his newfound power, embarking on a city-wide killing spree, a rampage of motiveless slaughter. He chose a name that reflected his new state of being, his love of bloodshed, carnage. The emergence of Carnage sent shockwaves through New York City. His brutality was unlike anything the city had witnessed. He killed indiscriminately, joyfully, turning streets into slaughterhouses. Spider-Man, upon learning of this new red symbiote, was horrified. He recognized the alien nature, but was outmatched by Carnage's ferocity, his unpredictability, and his sheer delight in violence. Carnage was stronger, faster, and more versatile in his destructive capabilities than Venom had ever been. His ability to shapeshift parts of his symbiote into deadly weapons made him an incredibly dangerous close-quarters combatant. It was at this desperate juncture that Spider-Man made a decision that would have been unthinkable previously. He realized he could not defeat Carnage alone. He needed help, and the only being with comparable power and knowledge of symbiotes, the only one who might understand the threat Carnage posed, was Venom. Spider-Man traveled to the remote island where Eddie Brock and the Venom symbiote were living in their self-imposed exile. He found them, surprisingly, living a relatively peaceful existence. Their hatred for him banked, though not extinguished, by the belief that he was dead. Peter had to reveal his deception, a tense moment that could have easily reignited their vendetta. However, the news he brought, the descriptions of Carnage's rampage, gave even Venom pause. Eddie Brock, for all his hatred of Spider-Man, possessed a warped moral code. He believed in protecting innocence. Carnage, their child in a biological sense, was an abomination to them. Cassidy's indiscriminate slaughter, his philosophy of pure chaos, was antithetical to Venom's twisted sense of order and justice. The symbiote, too, perhaps felt a primal responsibility or disgust towards its offspring's unrestrained violence. There was also, likely, an element of pride and jealousy. Carnage was an uncontrolled variable, a chaotic force that made Venom's own controlled brutality seem almost tame by comparison. They saw carnage not just as a threat to innocence, but as a stain on what they, as Venom, represented. And so, one of the most unlikely and uneasy alliances in superhero history was formed. Venom agreed to help Spider-Man stop Carnage. This was not born of friendship or forgiveness, but of necessity. Venom's condition was clear. They would help stop Carnage, their son, but their truce with Spider-Man was temporary. Once Carnage was dealt with, their feud would resume. The ensuing battle was epic. Spider-Man and Venom, two mortal enemies, fighting side by side against the force of pure mayhem that was Carnage. Their combined strength and tactical thinking were barely enough to contend with Carnage's unpredictable fury and deadly arsenal of symbiote weaponry. Spider-Man, agile and strategic. Venom, brutal and powerful. Against Carnage, a whirlwind of red death. The fight often pushed Venom to confront the darker aspects of their own nature, seeing in Carnage an echo of what they could become if they completely surrendered to their rage. It also highlighted the subtle differences in their powers. Carnage was often depicted as physically stronger than Spider-Man, but perhaps not as strong as a fully enraged Venom. Yet far more versatile and vicious with his shape-shifting weapon capabilities. Ultimately, it often took more than just their combined might. In many key storylines, figures like the Fantastic Four or other heroes had to be brought in to provide the necessary sonic or fiery firepower to subdue Carnage, whose resistance to these weaknesses sometimes seemed greater, or whose sheer ferocity made exploiting them incredibly difficult. Carnage was eventually defeated, captured, and imprisoned, often in Ravencroft Institute, a facility for the criminally insane that would become his frequent and frequently escaped from home. Feeling, perhaps, that New York City was too intrinsically linked to their feud with Spider-Man, or seeking a fresh start, a new hunting ground for their brand of twisted justice, Venom made a significant decision: to relocate. Their chosen destination was the vibrant, fog-shrouded city of San Francisco. This move marked a conscious effort, at least on Eddie Brock's part, to lean more into the protector aspect of their identity, to prove that they could be a force for their version of good. Away from the constant antagonism of their New York nemesis. In San Francisco, Venom attempted to establish themselves as the city's guardian, albeit a terrifying and lethal one. they began to target criminals, drug dealers, and those who preyed on the vulnerable, dispensing brutal, often fatal, justice. The city's underworld quickly learned to fear the massive, black-clad figure that stalked the night. A monstrous entity that communicated in plural whispers and left a trail of terrified or terminated lawbreakers in its wake. VENOM saw themselves as weeding out the true menaces to society, operating on a simple binary code. Those who were innocent deserved protection, and those who were guilty deserved punishment, often immediate and severe. Their methods were far from heroic in the traditional sense. They did not apprehend, they annihilated. They did not seek justice through courts. They were judge, jury, and executioner. This San Francisco experiment, as it might be retrospectively called, was fraught with complexity. While some citizens, terrorized by crime, might have secretly welcomed the sudden drop in certain illegal activities, the official authorities and much of the public were horrified by this new, monstrous vigilante. VENOM was still very much a dangerous, unpredictable force. Their understanding of innocence was subjective and often simplistic. Their rage easily triggered. Spider-Man, though miles away, would occasionally hear reports of VENOM's activities, his concern growing. Was this a genuine attempt at redemption, or merely a new stage for their violent tendencies? During this period, the internal dynamic between Eddie Brock and the symbiote continued to evolve. While their bond was incredibly strong, built on shared trauma and purpose, subtle distinctions in their individual desires began to emerge. Eddie Brock, influenced by his own deeply buried, perhaps twisted, sense of morality, and his past as a once legitimate journalist seeking to expose wrongs, genuinely started to believe in their role as protectors. He found a grim satisfaction in punishing those he deemed evil, a way to channel his aggression into something he could rationalize as positive. The symbiote, however, had more primal, alien concerns. Its primary drive remained survival and the maintenance of its bond with a strong, compatible host. While it supported Eddie's lethal protector activities, as they provided ample adrenaline, its primary food source, and opportunities to exert its power, its loyalty was first and foremost to the symbiotic relationship itself. It also carried within it the deep-seated fear of rejection and a yearning for acceptance that had defined its existence since being cast out from the Clintar. It needed Eddie, and it subtly manipulated his emotions and perceptions to ensure their bond remained paramount. If Eddie showed signs of wavering, of questioning their path, the symbiote would amplify his anger, his paranoia, reinforcing their shared hatred for Spider-Man or any perceived threat, thus solidifying their union. Moreover, the symbiote possessed knowledge and instincts far beyond human comprehension, including a deeper understanding of its own biology and the threats posed by others of its kind. This became crucial as the shadow of carnage continued to loom. Cletus Kasady, despite numerous defeats and incarcerations, possessed an uncanny ability to escape. His bond with the Carnage symbiote making him incredibly resilient and resourceful. Each time Carnage resurfaced, his rampages seemed more depraved, his lust for slaughter more insatiable. And each time, Venom often found themselves drawn back into the fray, sometimes reluctantly teaming up with Spider-Man or other heroes once more, because Carnage was an offense to their very being. A chaotic force they felt a primal responsibility to contain. These encounters were always brutal, pushing Venom to their limits and forcing them to confront the darkest aspects of their own lineage. But Carnage was not the only symbiotic threat to emerge from the shadows. The existence of Venom and Carnage had not gone unnoticed by certain amoral organizations who saw in these alien creatures not a terror, but an opportunity, a source of incredible biological weaponry. One such group was the Shadowy Life Foundation, an organization ostensibly dedicated to surviving a predicted global catastrophe by creating utopian, fallout-sheltered societies for their wealthy clientele. However, their methods were often ruthless and unethical. The Life Foundation, believing symbiotes to be the next step in personal defense and warfare, managed to capture Venom. Through horrific and invasive experiments, they forcibly extracted multiple seeds or offspring from the Venom symbiote. These 5 new symbiotes were then bonded to chosen security personnel from the Life Foundation, creating a team of symbiotic enforcers. These were Scream, a yellow and red female symbiote bonded to Donna Diego, often depicted as mentally unstable and wielding sonic attacks with her symbiotic hair. Phage, an orange male symbiote bonded to Karl Mach, who favored bladed weapons. Riot, a gray, blue, or black male symbiote bonded to Trevor Cole, known for his brute strength and hammer-like fists. Lasher, a green male symbiote bonded to Ramon Hernandez, who utilized whip-like tendrils. And Agony, a purple female symbiote bonded to Leslie Gesneria, who could metabolize and project acidic toxins. These Life Foundation symbiotes were initially tools, extensions of their human hosts' training and the Life Foundation's will. However, like all symbiotes, they possessed their own nascent desires and were heavily influenced by their hosts' personalities, which were often not of the noble Clinter ideal. They were less experienced than Venom, their control sometimes erratic, and their understanding of their own nature limited. Their emergence created a new layer of chaos. Venom, upon escaping the Life Foundation's clutches, often with the unwilling help of Spider-Man, who had tracked them down, found themselves confronted by these siblings. The reaction of Eddie and the Venom symbiote to these new offspring was complex. There was no parental affection. Instead, there was a mixture of revulsion, seeing their own essence twisted into these new forms by a corrupt organization, and perhaps a degree of predatory instinct. These new symbiotes were rivals, lesser beings, and in some instances, direct threats. Battles between Venom and the Life Foundation symbiotes were savage, a chaotic clash of alien powers. Sometimes, Venom would attempt to reabsorb these younger, weaker symbiotes, seeing them as errant parts of itself that needed to be reclaimed or destroyed. Other times, particularly when facing a common enemy, or when the hosts of the Life Foundation's symbiotes struggled for control, uneasy, temporary alliances might form, only to shatter just as quickly. The proliferation of their kind was a concerning development for Venom, a reminder of the potential for their biology to be exploited and twisted. Throughout all these trials, the specter of Eddie Brock's cancer remained a constant, underlying factor. The Venom symbiote, in its efforts to maintain its host's health and ensure their continued viability as a partner, actively suppressed Eddie's illness. It wasn't a cure. It was a state of enforced remission. The symbiote's energies kept the cancerous cells in check, effectively holding death at bay for Eddie. This created an even deeper level of codependency. Eddie knew, on some level, that separating from the symbiote for any extended period could mean a swift and painful relapse. This medical necessity often overrode any moral qualms he might have about their violent actions, or any desire for a normal life. The symbiote was, quite literally, keeping him alive, even as it fueled his darkest impulses. This biological imperative often gave the symbiote immense leverage in their internal relationship. There were moments, however, particularly during his time in San Francisco, or in the rare lulls between conflicts, where Eddie Brock, and perhaps even the symbiote, showed flashes of something approaching heroism, or at least a more nuanced understanding of their role. They might go to extraordinary lengths to protect an individual they genuinely perceived as innocent, demonstrating a fierce, almost paternalistic loyalty. They might uncover a larger conspiracy that even conventional heroes had missed, using their unique methods to expose corruption. In these instances, their actions, while still undeniably brutal, sometimes aligned with the greater good. These moments further complicated their relationship with Spider-Man and the broader hero community. Spider-Man, while never fully trusting Venom, began to see that they were not purely evil, that Eddie Brock, beneath the rage and the monstrous exterior, possessed a sliver of a conscience, however warped. Other heroes, less personally invested in Venom's history with Spider-Man, might see them as a dangerous but occasionally useful wild card, a necessary evil in a world filled with even greater threats. These gray areas, these moments of unexpected altruism or effective, albeit lethal, protection, prevented Venom from being simply dismissed as another monstrous villain. They were evolving, their path unpredictable, their motivations a tangled web of hatred, a desire for justice, a need for connection, and the primal instinct for survival. The proliferation of symbiotes, from Carnage to the Life Foundation's creations, also forced Venom into a reluctant position of authority, or at least expertise. They understood symbiote biology, weaknesses, and psychology better than anyone else on Earth. This knowledge, ironically, sometimes made them an invaluable, if deeply unsettling, asset to those who would normally be their enemies. The shadow of Knull, the ancient war against their dark creator, the noble aspirations of the Clintar, these were all echoes deep within the Venom symbiote's consciousness, perhaps influencing its reactions to the chaotic spread of its kind, pushing it towards a semblance of responsibility, even if only to eliminate inferior or overly destructive relatives. The bond between Eddie Brock and the symbiote, while incredibly strong and mutually sustaining, was not without its profound complexities and internal power struggles. An arc often referred to as separation anxiety brought these tensions to the forefront. During this period, there were instances where the symbiote was forcibly separated from Eddie, or circumstances arose where it had to act independently to protect him or itself. It was in these moments that the alien intelligence of the symbiote, its own fears, desires, and even a nascent personality distinct from Brock's, became more apparent. When separated, the symbiote was vulnerable, driven by a primal need to rejoin with a host, preferably Eddie, to whom it had developed a deep, possessive loyalty. It displayed cunning, resourcefulness, and a surprising capacity for independent thought and action, navigating complex environments, evading capture, and even communicating on a rudimentary level with others. These periods often highlighted the symbiote's deep-seated fear of abandonment, a trauma echoing its initial casting out from the Clintar hive and its rejection by Peter Parker. It saw Eddie not just as a host, but as its partner, its other half. The idea of permanent separation was for the symbiote akin to death or a profound, unbearable loneliness. It would go to extreme lengths, exhibiting surprising tenderness or terrifying ferocity to return to him. Conversely, Eddie Brock, when separated from the symbiote, would experience the full, aggressive return of his cancer, a painful and debilitating reminder of his dependency. He would also feel the psychological void left by the absence of the symbiote's presence, the sudden silence after being constantly connected to its alien thoughts and emotions. This separation anxiety was mutual, a testament to how deeply intertwined their existences had become. They were two broken halves that, together, formed a functional, if monstrous, whole. This period also saw the eruption of one of the most devastating and defining events in the symbiote saga: maximum carnage. Cletus Cassidy, the deranged host of the Carnage symbiote, once again escaped confinement. But this time, he did not embark on his killing sprees alone. He gathered a horrific family of like-minded, superpowered sociopaths, including the sonic screaming Shriek, who became his twisted lover, the Spider-Man doppelganger, a monstrous, six-armed, mindless duplicate of Spider-Man, and other villains like Demogoblin and Carrion. Together, they unleashed an unprecedented wave of anarchic violence and mass murder across New York City. Their goal simple: to spread as much chaos and death as possible, to revel in the breakdown of society. The scale of the threat was beyond anything Spider-Man could handle alone. The city descended into madness, its streets becoming war zones. Reluctantly, Spider-Man was forced to assemble his own coalition of heroes, and once again, anti-heroes. And once again, the most crucial and most volatile member of this temporary alliance was Venom. The threat of Carnage, their son, and his gleeful, indiscriminate slaughter was an affront to Venom's own lethal protector code. Carnage represented everything Venom, in their own twisted way, stood against: pure, motiveless chaos. The Maximum Carnage event was a brutal, sprawling conflict. Venom fought alongside Spider-Man, Captain America, Black Cat, Cloak and Dagger, Iron Fist, Morbius the Living Vampire, and others, against Carnage's horrific crew. The battles were fierce, destructive, and psychologically taxing. For Venom, it meant confronting the darkest reflection of their own potential, and working alongside heroes who fundamentally distrusted them. Eddie Brock's desire to protect innocence, however brutally, was pushed to its limits. He and the symbiote often clashed with Spider-Man over methods. Venom's lethal approach contrasting sharply with Spider-Man's refusal to kill. Yet, their raw power and intimate knowledge of carnage were indispensable. The event solidified Venom's status as a major player, capable of acting, however reluctantly, on the side of angels when faced with a sufficiently demonic threat. It also subtly shifted public perception, or at least the perception within the hero community. While still feared, Venom had demonstrated a capacity, however conditional, for cooperation against a common, overwhelming enemy. The scars of maximum carnage ran deep, both on the city and on the psyches of those involved. But it was a crucible that further forged Venom's complex identity. Following such large-scale conflicts, and during periods where Eddie Brock actively tried to steer their shared existence towards more overtly heroic endeavors, Venom's attempts to be accepted, or at least tolerated, continued. They might operate with slightly more restraint, though restraint for Venom was still a terrifying prospect for most criminals, or consciously try to collaborate with authorities, though such efforts were usually met with extreme suspicion and often ended in misunderstanding and conflict. The symbiote itself, perhaps sensing Eddie's desire for a less antagonistic existence, might subtly try to adapt, though its inherent alien nature and predatory instincts were never far from the surface. It was also during these periods of relative introspection, or through encounters with other cosmic entities or Clintar-related phenomena, that a deeper understanding of the symbiote's own heritage began to surface for both Eddie and the readers of their chronicles. The name Clintar, the concept of a noble race of symbiotic peacekeepers, the ancient war against the dark god Null. These pieces of lore, once obscure or unknown, started to filter into their narrative. The Venom symbiote was revealed not as an inherently evil creature, but as a member of a species with a complex history, a species capable of great good, but also susceptible to corruption if bonded with flawed hosts, or if its own psychological needs were unmet. This added another layer to the tragedy of Venom. The symbiote that clung to Eddie Brock was, in essence, an exile, cut off from its own kind's higher purpose, initially deemed insane, perhaps because its desire for a deep, permanent bond was misunderstood, or its first host was indeed corrupting. Its aggression, its possessiveness, its predatory tendencies could be seen not just as malice, but as the warped expressions of a creature desperate for connection, stability, and purpose, filtered through the lens of Eddie Brock's own trauma and rage. This understanding didn't excuse their violent actions, but it did provide a richer, more tragic context. Was the Venom symbiote capable of redemption, of reconnecting with the nobler aspects of its Clintar heritage? This became an ongoing question. The issue of Eddie Brock's cancer also saw significant developments. For a long time, the symbiote merely suppressed the illness. However, in some storylines, a more profound change occurred, perhaps through a unique interaction with other powerful entities, or through a deeper, more complete merging of their biologies. The symbiote managed to effectively cure or entirely consume Eddie's cancer. This event, when it occurred, had major implications. It lessened Eddie's physical dependency on the symbiote for sheer survival, though their psychological codependency remained incredibly strong. It could, paradoxically, create new tensions. If Eddie was no longer reliant on the symbiote to live, would he still choose to be Venom? Or would the symbiote, fearing this potential loss, exert even greater control? As the years passed, the very nature of what Venom meant began to shift. While Eddie Brock is considered the definitive and most iconic Venom, the symbiote itself, being a life form with its own drive for survival and bonding, did not remain exclusively with him forever. There were periods of separation, sometimes prolonged. During these times, or when Eddie was incapacitated or even temporarily reformed, the Venom symbiote sought out, or was sought by, other hosts. The passing of the Venom mantle, even temporarily, to other individuals brought new dynamics and interpretations to the character. Each new host brought their own personality, their own strengths and weaknesses, their own moral compass, or lack thereof, to the symbiotic relationship, resulting in different iterations of Venom. One notable host was Anne Weiing, Eddie Brock's ex-wife. In a moment of crisis, to save her life, Eddie temporarily allowed the symbiote to bond with her, transforming her into she-Venom. While powerful, the experience was deeply traumatic for Anne, who was not prepared for the symbiote's intensity and violent urges, leading to tragic consequences down the line and highlighting the psychological toll the symbiote could exact on an unwilling or unstable host. Later, for a significant period, the Venom symbiote was forcibly separated from Brock and bonded with Mac Gargan, previously the Scorpion. This Scorpion Venom was a far more villainous and monstrous iteration. Gargan's existing criminal nature and lack of Eddie's complex morality, allowing the symbiote's more predatory and aggressive instincts to come to the fore. This Venom was a fearsome member of Norman Osborn's Dark Avengers, a truly terrifying and almost uncontrollable force. Even Flash Thompson, Peter Parker's longtime friend and former high school bully, became a host for the VENOM symbiote under the government-controlled Project Rebirth 2.0. As Agent Venom, Flash, a war hero who had lost his legs in combat, used the symbiote, often suppressed by drugs to maintain control, as a powerful weapon for covert missions. This iteration explored themes of redemption, control, and heroism in a new light, with Flash genuinely trying to use the symbiote for good, even joining the Guardians of the Galaxy for a time. This period also saw the symbiote itself begin a journey of cleansing or healing, reconnecting briefly with the Clinter hive mind and rediscovering some of its nobler potential. These shifts in hosts demonstrated the symbiote's adaptability and its enduring nature. While its bond with Eddie Brock was foundational and possessed a unique intensity, the symbiote was a creature capable of forming new connections, each one adding a new chapter to its complex story. It underscored that Venom was not just one person, but a concept, a force, embodied by the alien creature and the host with whom it chose, or was forced, to merge. Eddie Brock, too, experienced periods without the symbiote, sometimes seeking redemption, sometimes succumbing to his old hatreds, and even bonding with other symbiotes, like becoming anti-Venom, a heroic figure with healing powers whose suit was formed from remnants of the Venom symbiote and his own altered physiology, possessing the ability to cure others of afflictions, including symbiotic influence. His journey remained inextricably linked to the world of symbiotes, even when not directly bonded with his original other.